who are missing will get here. So, my name is Ethan Rowland, and I'll just briefly introduce other people on the design team. And we own Appleseed Permaculture together. We're also blessed by our awesome architecture team. If each of you would just say your name. And actually, we're few enough people here that I'd love to just quickly hear everybody's name. So if we could just go around and do that, start here.
Christopher Mandel. Brenda Caldwell. Harry Holloway.
So as an introduction to this Workshop Zero for our overall design process, Diami and I have spent the last 2 weeks immersed in Bethany and the West River watershed. We've conducted 10 interviews with people in and around Bethany. We've looked through hundreds of town documents, including some going back to original documents of 1798. We've looked through over 1,000 pages of text. And in our interviews, we talked to everybody from the Bethany town tax collector to the mechanics, the two brothers who are mechanics who are right by this piece of land. So we got a wide cross-section of Bethany. And we've been so much in it that we've even been dreaming about it. So we've been really fully immersed in this project and are glad to be able to share some of our learnings with you all today. I also want to give thanks and gratitude to all the people who helped us along the way. The Bethany Historical Society, the library in the town of Bethany, the town tax collector, the folks at the town of Bethany, and basically everybody we met, the Albanian folks at both Teddy B's and also at the Corner Deli up the road. Everybody has just been really welcoming and supportive and helpful to this process. So there's a lot of people whose work we depended on to get to here. So I want to say thanks for that. We live on the hills of Bethany, where few of humankind we see, where few of human sound we hear, where nature's voices charm the ear, on the hills of Bethany. A very lonesome place, you'll say, in which to pass the time away, and yet in city's swarming hive, none better live than we and thrive, on the hills of Bethany. So this is a beautiful poem. It's in one of the books. There's a whole resource section. Yep. Yeah, Sketches of Bethany. It's a beautiful poem, and starts to get you a sense of this town that you may end up making home in. So, in order to do this work, it's important for us to not just start zoomed in on the property, and this is the property as it currently is, but it's important for us to go out. Up above New Haven, up above the Long Island Sound, all the way up and out to Earth. And it's important to think in this entire context, in this big global context, in order to figure out your place in the whole. And before I go on, would each of you be willing to share your name and something you love about your place, wherever that is?
Okay. Hi, I'm Ellen, and we live in Bethany. This is my daughter, and I love my deer.
Hi, I'm Maya. This is my mother. Previously stipulated. And as you could be previously stipulated, I am from Bethany, and I don't know. I love it there because it's just nice and quiet, and I don't know, it's just a nice place.
Yeah, we saw a bumper sticker as we were going around town that said, Bethany, #1 small town, which I love and I think is important, and that'll come out. But before we go into Bethany, we got to go back to here. This is North America at the present time. And in order to really understand this story, we have to go back 100 million years ago, 200 million years ago. I'm actually going to bring you back to 485 million years ago to look at what North America or proto-North America looked like. So this is proto-North America, and you can see a little thing here that says proto-CT, proto-Connecticut. It was actually in the ocean. It was in a little chain called in between the continent here and the Iapetus Ocean, which is an ancient ocean 485 million years ago. around this time, the continents were beginning to move together. So continents, it's crazy if you go back this far in time. The continents are floating all over the earth like ice cubes in a thing of water. And these two continents are starting to come together. And as that happened, it created a volcanic island chain off the coast of proto-North America. That's something like what you now see in Japan. Okay, so these are gigantic volcanoes erupting off the coast of proto-North America. As this plate continued to push in, they crashed together, metamorphosizing the rock, making it really hard. And these volcanoes, they were once, miles high, and they eroded and eroded over time, but you can still see the traces of them and experience them right here in Connecticut. Actually, a lot of your geological history has to do with fire and magma. So these volcanoes, the little humps that remain of them are what are called domes. And there's a couple domes right near here. There's the Waterbury Dome, this white area. This was like the core of a gigantic volcano. Also the Seymour Dome, which is just Bethany, sort of on the eastern slopes coming down from the Seymour Dome, is one of those volcanic island chains off the coast of proto-North America. Crazy, huh? Jumping forward 100 million years to 360 million years ago. You have proto-Connecticut. There you see the island chain has crashed up against the shore. And this is this is sort of the ancestral Appalachian Mountains. Okay? Most of what is now North America is under a shallow inland sea. At the same time, the continents are coming closer together. This is Gondwana land, which later became Africa. This continent, as it gets close, causes what's called the Acadian mountain building event, which is, if you had to do the geology of Connecticut in one word, it would be crunch. Okay, over and over again, Connecticut is crunch, built up. The different land that lays across the entire state was built up from different continents crashing in over millions and millions of years. Okay, so this Gondwana land, as it crashes up into proto-Connecticut, it forms Pangaea, the ancient supercontinent of Pangaea, 245 million years ago. This line represents the equator. So at this point, all of these continents were floating down near the equator. So the climate here was more or less like it is currently in the Bahamas. Okay, so there's huge amounts of vegetative growth, all sorts of thing growing. It was tropical, it was wet, it was green. This is some of the foundation for our current fossil fuel economy was growing, taking in the ancient sunlight at this time. However, because the huge mass of these pieces of gigantic rock stuck together, they began to weigh down on the Earth's mantle below it. And that pushed down, and the pressure turned into heat, and that melted the rock further down. And so this giant furnace of molten rock underneath here begins to bubble up and push the continents away from each other. As that happened, as this rip starts to open up, here you can see it, Pangaea begins to split. The ocean rushes in, proto-Connecticut is sort of right on the edge. Pangaea begins to split apart. Here's proto-North America. Here's what was Europe and Africa. And as these continents split apart, the molten magma, the basaltic magma, started coming up. Okay? Eventually, this rift here formed the Atlantic Ocean. This rift started to open 200 million years ago, and the Atlantic Ocean is still opening and widening right now at a rate of 2.5 centimeters per year. So we're still floating further away from Europe and Africa. But around this time, it was thinning, this was getting thinner, the magma was rising up, and it happened again right here in what became the Hartford Basin. It started to rip open, and the magma came bubbling up and caused this series of 3 volcanic magma and lava flows flowing across the entire hundreds of miles from right where we are here. Right? These magma flows covered an area that went all the way up to Holyoke in Massachusetts. And many of the ridges that are in this valley grew from this magma rising up in the earth, like that one, like East Rock and West Rock Ridge. Okay, so here's a geological diagram of the state of Connecticut. Here's where Bethany is. We're down here in New Haven. As Charlotte just pointed out, here is some of the red represents where the magma, as these continents were pulling apart, the magma rose up and spilled out across the whole landscape. That magma, for the most part, that basalt has mostly washed away. What remains was that down in the earth, before it reached the surface, some of that lava hardened. It got really hard, but it was rising up, so it was in this shape. Everything else, over millions of years, eroded away, leaving the tops of West Rock Ridge and East Rock Ridge and the Metacomet Ridge, which runs all the way through the Central Valley of Connecticut. So the features, the landscape features, the geology that you're experiencing here today is the result of this gigantic fiery magma coming up from the earth and spewing out across the landscape. Pretty wild, huh? It's also important to notice this division, that this was sort of pulling apart, and then later more crashed on. Another volcanic island chain crashed onto here, okay? And all of it kind of crunching together. Welcome. Come on in. Okay, so fast forward in time, erosion, erosion, erosion. The gigantic mountain chains that were built up eroded away. Sometimes they were 6 miles high, sometimes 4 miles high, higher than the Himalayas are now. They've all just ground into the landscape that we see today. But you can still see the remnants here in Connecticut of this lava ridge and the different volcanic domes that exist, and they go all the way up into Massachusetts. Millions of years later, the next really important geological event, actually in the last 2 million years from now, this period of ice ages began to happen, where it got very, very cold and huge glaciers covered the earth for 60 or 70,000 years. This is an example of an image of the last glaciation, where the Laurentide ice sheet almost entirely covered this huge area. This is Greenland up here. This is North America. At that point, North America had more or less moved to its current shape. But the ice sheet pressed down with, sometimes 2-mile thick glaciers spreading out, and they came down from the North Pole as the climate cooled, and they pushed down this way, and there was such enormous weight on the ground that you can basically think of them as like a huge snowplow or huge bulldozer just pushing across the landscape, grinding the stones into grit and carrying them with it like an enormous plow. How far south did the glaciers get? Long Island. Not Long Island Sound, but Long Island. The outer edge of Long Island, this is the furthest extent south that the glaciers made it. They stopped there and began depositing all of the stuff that they had scraped along the way and leaving it there and leaving it there. And then as they came back, they stopped again at the other side of Long Island and dumped and dumped and dumped. And then they pulled back further to the coast and dumped and dumped and dumped. All of this rock and sand and clay and grit and gravel, and all of this area of southern Connecticut, that little red bit is, again, where Bethany is. All of this got covered with a really rich layer of glacial till. Because it was all this rock dust and minerals scraped from all the way up here, it actually made for quite fertile soil. And so some of the soils on the tops of the hills in Bethany and in other towns in the area were quite rich and suitable for agriculture. As the glaciers receded, 16,000 years ago, 14,000 before Common Era, it left an open tundra, an Arctic tundra across much of the Northeast. In this tundra, the last age of megafauna, the big animals, started roaming across the landscape, eating the vegetation that grew up. This was the time of the woolly mammoths and the mastodons and other creatures that you've probably heard less of. Down here is a little hard to see. This is the giant ground sloth, and this is the giant armadillo. For scale, that's a mountain lion, which existed at these times as well. So we've got armadillos and ground sloths larger than mountain lions roaming the landscape, eating the vegetation. Horses, camels, even buffalo. The buffalo would come from the Midwestern prairies, and they would range all the way out along the coastal prairies, which is what this once was right here, and they would graze all the way out on Cape Cod. There's records of buffalo grazing there. Around this time, along with the animals, some of the first peoples that we have evidence of began to arrive in this place. These people are generally known as the Paleo-Indians. And this is not a photograph of the Paleo-Indians 12,000 years ago. It's a, it's a photograph of some of the peoples that came many thousands of years later. But at this time, people were mainly nomadic. They were gathering and hunting and moving across the landscape, getting food where it was abundant, eating the greens and the nuts and the berries, and hunting the game where they could. These people, thousands of years later, about 6,000 years ago, began to develop what we now call the Eastern Agricultural Complex, the Eastern Woodlands Agricultural Complex. This is the first time where we have evidence of people starting to domesticate plants. So at this time, they domesticated gourds, little gourds that were probably used for bowls and drinking. They domesticated something called a groundnut, which is a nitrogen-fixing edible tuber. They domesticated sunflowers, annual and perennial sunflowers, some of which we still have and eat now. The sunchoke, or the Jerusalem artichoke, was domesticated at this time 6,000 years ago.